An elderly man threw his K9's German Shepherd from the 15th floor. What happened next will shock you. He was a retired K9 hero, loyal, disciplined, and brave. But after years of service, his fate took a dark and heartbreaking turn when a desperate elderly man made a cruel and irreversible decision. No one expected what the German Shepherd would do next or who would come into his life at the exact moment he needed a miracle. This isn't just a story about survival. It's about redemption, loyalty, and a second chance that no one saw coming. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. This helps us bring more inspiring stories like this to you. The screams came first. A woman walking her baby in the courtyard below dropped her coffee and looked up just in time to see a dark blur fall past her line of vision. Then the thud. Neighbors gasped, some frozen in shock, others rushing toward the source of noise. On the cold concrete at the base of a high-rise apartment building in downtown Chicago lay a German Shepherd. His body twisted unnaturally, blood pooling around him, but his chest was still moving. He was alive, barely. One teenage boy, who had been skateboarding nearby, tore off his hoodie and ran to the dog's side. "Somebody call 911, please. He's breathing." His voice cracked with panic. The building security guard sprinted over, already on the radio. Residents leaned out of windows, cell phones raised. The whisper started immediately. He fell from the 15th floor. Someone said the old man threw him. Within minutes, paramedics arrived. They carefully lifted the German Shepherd onto a stretcher made for large dogs. His breathing shallow, his eyes fluttering closed, his front leg clearly broken, and the fall had fractured several ribs. But the look in his eyes before they shut was not one of pain. It was betrayal. At the City Animal Trauma Center, Dr. Melissa Hart hadn't had a lunch break in 12 hours, but when she saw the gurney roll in, she stopped everything. "What happened to him?" she asked, already pulling on gloves. "Fell from a building, 15th floor. They think someone pushed him," the paramedic replied. Melissa leaned in close. The dog's coat was scarred, his ears clipped. She could tell immediately this was no ordinary pet. "He's AK-9, she whispered. The dog's tags were missing, but the signs were there: military training, muscle tone, battle-worn eyes. This dog had served someone, loved someone, and yet someone had thrown him away like garbage. "We're not losing him," Melissa said. "Not today." Across town, Detective Jason Rose slammed a file on his desk. "You're telling me a retired Army dog was thrown off a balcony by his owner?" Officer Blake, standing stiffly beside him, nodded. "The neighbors say the old man was acting strange. His name's Harold Decker. Former Army. Lives alone. He hasn't opened the door yet." Jason stood up. "Let's go in." Apartment 1507. Harold Decker sat alone in the kitchen, a broken leash lying on the floor. His hands trembled. He hadn't meant to hurt him, but his mind was fading. The memories were jumbled. Sometimes he thought he was still on patrol. Sometimes he saw enemies in the shadows. The medication hadn't worked. The world had become too loud, too fast, too much. "I thought he was attacking me," he muttered to himself, tears in his eyes. Then the banging on the door. "Mr. Decker, this is the police. Open up." Harold didn't move, but in his heart, something cracked. He remembered the dog's name, Shadow, and in that moment, he realized he had pushed away the only living soul who had never given up on him. Back at the trauma center, Melissa sat beside Shadow's crate. The dog was sedated, hooked to 4 fluids, his body wrapped in bandages, but his heart was still beating. She gently placed her hand on his paw. "Whoever you are, you didn't deserve this." Then she noticed something, a faint tattoo beneath his fur. Numbers, a military ID. Her eyes widened. This dog had a past. And now someone needed to uncover it. Because whatever happened on that balcony wasn't just an accident. It was a beginning of something much deeper. Melissa Hart had treated hundreds of dogs in her 10 years as an emergency vet, but none had shaken her quite like this one. Shadow, though no one knew that was his name yet, had survived a fall that should have been fatal. He had 2 fractured ribs, a shattered front leg, internal bleeding and deep bruising across his spine, but he was breathing, and now he was fighting. She stayed late that night, long after the other staff had gone home. The clinic's hallway lights were dimmed, casting a soft glow across the recovery room. Shadow lay curled in a medical crate, his body still weak, but his eyes were now open, watching. He didn't flinch when she approached. Instead, he just stared. "You're not just a dog," she whispered, kneeling down in front of the crate. "You're a soldier." The numbers tattooed faintly inside his right ear confirmed it. Military ID tags were common for dogs in service, but there was something else in his eyes, an awareness. He was trying to understand why he was here, why he had been betrayed. "I don't know what happened to you up there," she continued, "but I promise you're safe now." Shadow blinked slowly, his breath shallow. Melissa reached into her coat pocket and placed a small plush toy inside the crate. Something soft, a simple gesture, but he nudged it with his nose and let it rest against his face. That was the moment she knew he was still in there, beneath trauma, pain, and confusion, but still there. The next morning, Detective Jason Rose stood in Melissa's office, holding a cup of burnt hospital coffee and a folder in his hand. "He has no collar, no chip," he said, but that number in his ear led us to the Department of Defense record. Dog's name is Shadow. Retired K9. Served in Afghanistan. 3 deployments. Melissa looked up from her desk. Then why was he with Harold Decker? Thiers on site. Decker was his last handler. After the dog was decommissioned, Harold kept him as a companion. The Army allows that sometimes with long-term partners. Shadow lived with him for 2 years after retirement, and then Harold threw him out a window, she said, her voice tight with disbelief. Jason nodded. "Decker's been taken in for psychiatric evaluation. He's not well, early dementia, PTSD. He claimed Shadow attacked him, but I think he just didn't know where he was anymore." Melissa folded her arms. "So what happens now?" "That's the problem," Jason said. "Without a legal owner and with a military record, Shadow's technically government property. They're deciding whether to put him down." The words hit her like ice. "Put him down," she repeated. "He survived a 15-story fall. He served 3 tours, and now they want to kill him?" Jason nodded grimly. "It's protocol. Severe injuries, behavioral risk, paperwork, not people." Melissa stood up. "No, I won't let that happen." "You don't get a say," he said. "I'm not asking for one," she replied sharply. "I'll file for temporary custody. As a licensed trauma veterinarian, I can argue medical necessity, and once he's stable, I'll find someone who understands what this dog's been through." Jason studied her for a moment, then gave a small smile. "You're not like the other vets." "I don't treat statistics," she replied. "I treat lives." That night, Melissa stayed by Shadow's side again. The city outside the clinic was quiet. Inside, machines beeped steadily. Shadow had eaten a little for the first time. His eyes followed her now, not with fear, but trust. She gently stroked the fur near his ears, avoiding the stitches. "They think you're broken," she whispered. "But I think you're stronger than any of them." He didn't move, but his tail gave the faintest twitch. Melissa smiled. "They don't know who you are," she said, "but I do now." His eyes closed slowly, his breath evening out. She leaned in and, for the first time, called him by name. "Rest, Shadow. We're not done yet." But outside the clinic walls, forces were already moving. Files were being signed, and people who had never met Shadow were preparing to make a decision that could end his life. Melissa didn't know it yet, but she was about to fight a battle of her own, one she never saw coming. For the first time in days, the sun broke through the clouds over Chicago. Inside the trauma center, the mood was far from bright. But in room 4, something extraordinary was happening. Shadow stood, not long, not confidently, and not without pain, but with trembling legs and burning will. He rose from his bedding and took one step forward. Then another. Melissa, standing silently just outside his crate, held her breath. Her heart was in her throat. He stumbled, then steadied himself. "Good boy," she whispered, barely containing the emotion in her voice. "That's it, Shadow. That's how we fight." Shadow looked up at her. and for the first time, his eyes didn't just follow her out of instinct. They recognized her. Something in the depth of his gaze told Melissa she wasn't just another caretaker. She was the one person left in the world who hadn't given up on him. And she couldn't, because the clock was ticking. That afternoon, Melissa sat across from a cold-faced woman in a gray suit at the Department of Defense liaison office. His body is healing. He's alert, responsive, showing no signs of aggression, Melissa said firmly. The woman raised an eyebrow. And yet the last documented report involves an alleged attack on a civilian, his handler. This civilian, Melissa argued, has been diagnosed with early dementia and was having a severe episode. Shadow was confused. He didn't attack. He waited. He let people help him. He didn't lash out once. I'm not here to debate emotional interpretation, Dr. Hart, the woman said calmly. The report on file states behavioral instability following trauma per K9 decommission protocol. The next step is euthanasia. Melissa snapped, standing up. You mean to kill a decorated war dog because he had the audacity to survive being thrown out a window? The woman didn't flinch. We're still evaluating, but let's not get overly sentimental. These dogs serve a purpose. When that purpose ends, they're retired or released. He was already retired. Now he's injured, dangerous. The risk outweighs the reward. Melissa's voice shook. He gave his life to protect others. 3 tours. I've seen dogs give less and get medals. Shadow gets a death sentence because someone failed him. The liaison stood too, gathering her files. You have until Friday. If no one legally adopts him by then, we proceed. Melissa didn't speak as the woman left, but inside, something hardened. She wasn't going to lose him. Not like this. Back at the clinic. Shadow had made it halfway across the recovery room by late afternoon. One of the vet techs, Sarah, held a soft towel sling under his belly to support his weight as he walked. Each movement was labored but steady. Jason Rowe arrived just as Shadow was lowering himself carefully onto his bedding. Is that really the same dog? He asked, watching in disbelief. Same heart, Melissa said quietly. Same fire. Jason stepped closer. You've made progress. Melissa glanced at him, her expression unreadable. Not fast enough. They're giving me for more days. Jason shook his head. I don't get it. We spend millions training these dogs, trust them with our lives, then drop them like trash when they don't fit the mold anymore. They don't see dogs, Melissa murmured. They see tools. Jason knelt by the crate. Hey, buddy. Shadow lifted his head. Do you remember me? Jason asked softly. You and I used to work the same bases. Afghanistan, 2017. Your name came up in patrol logs. You saved lives. You earned your place. Shadow blinked, then nudged his nose gently toward Jason's hand. Jason swallowed hard. You're worth fighting for, he said. Melissa watched, her mind already racing. Maybe, just maybe, Jason could be the answer. A former soldier, stable income, law enforcement background. He understood dogs like Shadow. Understood what it meant to be wounded and to keep walking anyway. Would you? She began and hesitated. Would you ever consider adopting him? Jason looked at her in surprise, then at Shadow. Then he nodded. I would, he said, but I've got one condition. What's that? You stay in his life. You're the reason he got this far. I think he needs both of us now. Melissa felt something catch in her chest. For the first time in days, hope was more than just a whisper. It had a name, and it was beginning to rise. Friday. The word echoed through Melissa's head like a ticking clock. 2 days. That's all they had. Shadow had made remarkable progress. He could now walk 10 feet without assistance. He responded to his name, obeyed simple commands, and had even begun wagging his tail faintly when Melissa or Jason entered the room. But for the Department of Defense, none of it mattered. A single form, a single stamp, and everything they had fought for would be erased. Melissa spent her mornings at the clinic and her evenings writing appeal letters, calling military contacts, emailing senators. Some promised to look into it. Others ignored her completely. Jason had filed official paperwork to adopt Shadow, but the bureaucracy dragged like wet cement. I don't understand why they're pushing back, he muttered, pacing the clinic hallway. My record is clean. I'm a former Marine. I've handled dogs in combat. What more do they want? They don't want anything, Melissa said. They just don't want to be responsible. Shadow, lying on his mat nearby, watched him with quiet eyes. His body was healing, but the sadness hadn't fully left his gaze. He sensed something. Dogs always did. Melissa knelt by him and stroked his fur. I don't know how to tell you this, buddy, she whispered, but we're running out of time. Shadow closed his eyes, pressing his head gently into her hand. Later that afternoon, an envelope arrived at the clinic. Jason opened it while Melissa held her breath. Then she saw his face go cold. They're denying the adoption request, he said, his voice low. They flagged Shadow as potentially unstable and unsuitable for reintegration. Melissa felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. No appeal, no discussion. They want him euthanized by noon Friday. That's 41 hours from now. She leaned against the wall, stunned. They're really going to kill him. Jason looked at Shadow, lying peacefully on his blanket. He saved lives, he said, and now they want to erase as like it never mattered. Early the next morning, Melissa woke to an idea, desperate, reckless, but maybe their only shot. She called Jason. I have one last card to play. By noon, they were in front of a local news station. Jason in uniform, Melissa in scrubs, and Shadow standing tall, still limping but proud at their side. The reporter raised an eyebrow. You're saying the government wants to euthanize a retired war hero? That's exactly what I'm saying, Melissa replied. This dog saved American soldiers overseas. He survived a 15-story fall, and now he's being thrown away by the very system that trained him. Jason stepped forward. He's not just a dog. He's a veteran. And veterans don't deserve to be silenced, especially not like this. Within hours, the segment aired across Chicago, then across the state, then across the country. Hashtag Justice for Shadow started trending on social media. Thousands of comments poured in. Adopt him. This is outrageous. My husband served with K9S. This is heartbreaking. Give him the medal he deserves. By nightfall, the Department of Defense's inbox was flooded. News anchors called for interviews. Local politicians issued statements. Melissa watched it all unfold in disbelief. Her hands trembled as she scrolled through the outpouring of support. Shadow lay at her feet, his head resting on her boot. He didn't know what was happening out there, but he knew something had changed. People were fighting for him, and for once, he wasn't alone. But at 11:42 a.m. the next day, just 18 minutes before the execution order was set to go into effect, Melissa received a final email. Order halted. Review pending. She sank into her chair and let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding for days. Jason, reading over her shoulder, broke into a grin. We bought time. Melissa looked down at Shadow, who raised his head slightly. Not just time, she whispered. Hope. But she knew the fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. Melissa thought the worst was behind them. The public outcry had stalled the execution order. Shadow was improving day by day, and Jason had even started working on getting him certified as a therapy dog for veterans, an idea that could both protect Shadow and give his life new purpose. But just when the clouds began to part, the storm returned. It started with a phone call late in the evening. Melissa had just closed the clinic when her personal phone rang. The number was blocked. Dr. Hart? Yes. This is Colonel Richard Evans, Department of Military Investigations. Her heart skipped. Is this about Shadow? I need to speak with you immediately. It concerns his record. Within 30 minutes, she and Jason were in a cold, gray office downtown. Facing the colonel, stern, sharp-eyed, and surrounded by files. He slid one forward. We reviewed Shadow's case again, and we found something disturbing, he said. Jason leaned forward. What kind of something? The colonel opened the folder. A series of incident reports, dates, coordinates, names, and one photograph. A dusty military compound in Kandahar, 2019. In the center, Shadow, baring his teeth, held back by his handler. Blood on the ground. Chaos in the background. This, Colonel Evans said, was a fatal mission, a civilian casualty. The reports were sealed until now. Melissa's hands trembled. What are you saying? There are claims, he continued, that Shadow misfired, that he attacked a civilian interpreter during an ambush. The Army covered it up to protect morale, but now that he's back in the public eye, some want justice. Jason stood abruptly. That's not justice. That's a scapegoat. We're reopening the investigation. Evans said calmly, until then, all rehabilitation, adoption, and public use of Shadow is suspended. Melissa was stunned. You can't be serious. That mission happened in the middle of combat. There's no way he acted without reason. That's not your call to make, Doctor. Jason's fists clenched. And who exactly made the call to bury the file in the first place? Evans didn't answer, but they both knew this wasn't about the truth. It was about politics. Back at the clinic, Melissa sat on the floor beside Shadow's crate, her head in her hands. He rested quietly, but his ears flicked, sensing her despair. Jason paced. They're going to use this to end it, Melissa. They waited for a reason to justify putting him down. Now they've got one. He was in combat, she whispered. He was protecting his team. I know that. You know that. But they want silence. Melissa looked at Shadow, whose eyes locked with hers. I won't let them bury him for a second time, she said. He already paid the price once. Jason knelt beside her. Then we need the truth. Melissa nodded slowly. There was one survivor from that mission, another soldier, a medic named Elijah Grant. I saw the name in the report. He's in Texas now. Jason's eyes narrowed. Then that's where we go. The next day, Melissa and Jason were on a flight with Shadow, travel approved for medical reasons only, barely slipping through before the suspension order was finalized. In a quiet rural town outside Houston, they found Elijah Grant on a small ranch with goats, chickens, and an artificial leg. The man looked surprised, but not unhappy to see them. Shadow, he said softly, crouching to his knees. The dog sniffed him, then licked his hand. You remember me? Elijah whispered. Melissa stepped forward. We need to know the truth. Kandahar, 2019. Did Shadow attack a civilian? Elijah stood, eyes heavy with memory. No, he said. That man wasn't civilian. He had turned. He was feeding intel to the enemy. I saw the grenade in his belt. Shadow got him first. Saved us all. Melissa's breath caught. Then why didn't you speak up? They told me to stay quiet, he said. Said it would complicate things. Said Shadow was just a dog. Jason stepped forward. He wasn't just a dog. He was a soldier. Elijah nodded. He still is. He paused and added, I'll testify. I'll write a sworn statement. Whatever it takes. Melissa smiled through tears. It might be enough to save him. She looked down at Shadow, calm, proud, and loyal to the end. He had saved lives in war. Now, finally, someone would save his. Elijah's sworn statement hit the inboxes of military officials by sunrise. It was short, direct, and undeniable. Shadow saved our lives. Any claim against him is a lie. The public rallied harder. A congressman called for an investigation. Hashtag surge again. But still, Melissa received no response from the Department of Defense until one simple message arrived. Review complete. Execution order revoked. Shadow is cleared. Melissa cried when she read it. Jason hugged her tight. Shadow barked softly as if he knew. He had fought every war they threw at him, and he had finally won the last one. 6 months later, Shadow trotted to the rehab center for veterans, wearing a blue service vest and moving with quiet pride. He stopped beside a young soldier in a wheelchair, leaned his head on the man's knee, and waited. The soldier smiled through tears. He came to me, he whispered. Melissa watched from a distance. Heart full, Jason stood beside her. You gave him back his purpose, he said. No, she replied softly. He gave us ours. Shadow had been thrown away, but love and loyalty had brought him back.